Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 595. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. In this SPaMCAST 595, we feature our interview with Vladimir Khorikov. Vladimir and I geeked out on unit testing in his new book, Unit Testing Principles, Practices, and Patterns. Our conversations covered the gamut with a discussion of writing from first principles, understanding and tuning the signal-noise to ratio in unit testing, and tests that are better at proving the negative than the positive. Vladimir Khorikov is a software engineer and author of several popular Pluralsight courses. He's been professionally involved in software development for over 15 years, including mentoring teams on the ins and outs of unit testing. The biggest advantage of his teaching style, and the one students often praise, is his tendency to have a strong theoretic background, which he then applies to practical examples. By the way, Manning Publications has kindly supplied the SPaMCAST with a few ebook codes. If you're interested, and you should be, email the Software Process and Measurement Cast at spamcastinfo@gmail.com with your favorite quote from this interview, and I will randomly draw winners on April 18th. Are you ready to talk unit testing? It's time for the interview. Vladimir Khorikov, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Yeah, this is actually really exciting. People actually do find this out because I'm not that terribly shy about it, but I'm an ex-tester and an ex-coder, so I think I have an understanding of unit test, and after reading your book, I actually have decided that I'm not sure I really ever got it right to begin with. Yeah, but, hey, I still have code running 20 years later, and don't tell anybody, but it's still an assembler, so it's still running somewhere.
That's a good indication. I remember assembly was one of my first languages in university, and it's really hard to get it done. Get it right.
Well, after a while you got used to it, and I'm probably significantly older than you, but when I first learned it, it was at Louisiana State University, and we were still using punch cards. And you learned very early on that you should number your darn cards, because if you dropped a deck, it was a mess. Yeah, but c'est la vie. Times change, and we all change with it, or we become dinosaurs. Vladimir, when you wrote Unit Testing Principles, Practices, and Patterns, better yet, why don't we start actually in the shallow end? Why don't you help my listeners with a definition of unit testing?
Unit testing is testing that is done by developers. So that is how I define it. And there are a lot of smaller kind of characteristics that distinguish between unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing. But you can basically lump all these three categories together by saying that it is tests that are written by the same developers who write the code that those unit tests are covering.
Is unit testing always done?
No, it's not. It's definitely not. And nowadays, it's more prevalent than, let's say, 10 years ago when I started in development. But it's still not as prevalent as it could be. Of course, I think that unit testing should be done basically on each and every project. And there is a lot of progress in that regard, where a lot of companies do employ unit testing in their projects. But there still is this gap where it's not enough to just write unit tests. You also need to write them in a way that helps your project and does not impede the development. So if you look at online materials and a lot of existing books, they are great for someone who doesn't have almost any experience with unit testing. But if you already have some experience, you basically are left to your own devices. And to get to the next level, you will have to do a lot of trial and error, and there's not much you can learn from anywhere to get to that next level. And now with the book, I tried to fill this gap. I tried to show developers who already have some experience what they can do to improve their unit testing skills.
Yeah, as I said, having lived in the trenches at one point in my career, both in the coding and the testing side, I actually got a lot out of this, and I actually feel bad for some of the work that I have done. I really did enjoy the story that you told all the way back in the prefix, right? Where you were doing basically your first coding and you did that unit testing and it took so long. And it sort of set up some internal cognitive dissonance. At least in the book, that sounds like it was the start of the journey that now is this book. And obviously a lot of time went by. But why did you recognize that? What was it that really caused you to step back and say, you know what, it works, but there's something wrong here?
Yeah, it's I probably just got lucky because I didn't forgo unit testing practices at that time. So yeah, you're right. So my first impression of unit testing was that, well, it kind of works, it kind of maybe helps, but I'm not sure it's worth it because all those unit tests, they added up a lot of maintainability overhead. So along with, aside from the code itself, I now have to maintain all those unit tests, and they broke with any opportunity. So basically, with any refactoring you do, half of your tests are now broken, and you need to not only refactor the code itself, but you also have to fix those broken tests. And it didn't seem right. And I got lucky in a sense that I didn't forgo these unit testing practices, and I tried to learn further. I did a lot of trial and error, and I think I figured out the way to improve unit testing such that you don't spend a lot of time maintaining them, but you still get a lot of value out of those unit tests. So that's the idea behind good unit test practices. You have to structure your code and unit tests in such a way that you don't spend a lot of time maintaining them, but still get a lot of value out of them. So basically, the return on your effort in unit tests, it should be high enough to justify the introduction of those unit tests in your project.
Absolutely. If you were sitting in front of or standing in front of a group of just brand new coders that had been taught how to write, you pick the language and you were attempting to tell them what the value of unit testing, or better yet, a whole bunch of newly minted managers who tell their coders not to unit test, what would you tell them was the value of doing unit testing?
There are a couple of thoughts, schools of thoughts on what value unit test provides. And one of them is that unit tests help you improve your code design. And it is definitely true, but I think it's not the main reason why you want to unit test your code. So I like to say that unit tests are a good negative indicator, but they are a bad positive one. And what it means is that if your code is hard to unit test, then it's a good indication that there is something wrong with that code, that you didn't structure it correctly, you didn't separate it from out of process dependencies. So something is wrong with that. But if you are able to unit test that code, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that your code design is correct, is good enough. So while unit testing is definitely a good litmus test in that regard, I think still that the main goal, the main reason why you would want to introduce unit tests is to enable sustainable growth of your software project. Because unit testing is basically a way to automate a lot of regression testing. And without that automation, you will have to spend an increasingly larger amount of time testing your previous features, making sure that you don't break the previous functionality with your new functionality. And as the project grows, it becomes harder and harder to do that because you have more and more features. And the more features and more code you have, the larger becomes the surface area for potential bugs. And with unit tests, you have a way to automatically test every previous features and focus your time and energy on introducing new features, on evolving the project. So that's, I think, the main reason why you would want to unit test it. Not because of any code design, but because without unit tests, you will basically become stuck at some point in the future, regression testing all the previous functionality or fixing all the bugs you introduce because you didn't have that regression testing in production.
I relatively recently, about a year ago at this point, worked with an organization. I walked in and I was told that the team that I was going to be working with was doing, I'm going to hold my hands when I say this, 8-week sprints. Scrum and doing 8-week sprints, and that roughly 7 weeks of that was regression testing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Just the level of overhead that had been, most of it was actually not automated. It was mostly manual testing. But the level of the level of overhead by not really coupling unit and regression and some of the other forms of integration tests was enormous. If that's the main payback, obviously for them it would have been huge, or is huge now that they've straightened that out. But at the same time, they were going through and they were able to talk about 100% code coverage. Are you a fan of code coverage, branch coverage? How do you look at those two metrics?
Code coverage and branch coverage is a way to measure the amount of code that is covered by unit tests, and which is itself is a way to measure how good or how prevalent or your tests are. So whether or not you have enough of those unit tests. So code coverage can be a good indication of a trend. So if your code coverage is trending down or significantly down, then it could be a good indication that something wrong happening. That maybe when you write new code, you don't introduce enough unit tests. And it can also be a good negative indicator. So just like unit tests themselves, the ability to unit test your code can be a good negative indicator about your code design. Code coverage metrics, they also can be a good negative indicator saying that there is something wrong with your code. So for example, if your code coverage metric shows you really low coverage numbers, say something like 40%, so anything less than 50%, then it's a good indication that you don't test enough and you need to introduce more tests. But again, if you have a large coverage number, then it doesn't mean anything and in the book, I actually told that story, which happened to me. So I once worked on a project, it was a long time ago when the unit testing practices were not as prevalent as they are now. So I worked on a project and there was this conference about unit testing, and a lot of developers from that company went to this conference, and it was really exciting. The conference was great. People talked about many things, and in particular about unit testing. And when people got back in the company, they decided to, we now need to implement all those practices, all those techniques that were told in this conference. And so they lobbied the upper management to impose this company-wide policy to have 100% test coverage. And it didn't work out well, as you might imagine. Because what people did is they thought, I have to achieve this code coverage number, and without that, you will not be able to check in your code. So there was this coverage number check that was built in into the build pipeline, and with that, if the coverage number went lower than 100%, the build was automatically rejected. And so a lot of people realized at that moment that, well, what should I do? Okay, I can game this metric by introducing basically assertion-free tests. And these are tests where you write code, when you write a test that doesn't have any assertions, so it basically just executes all the code, but doesn't assert anything. And it was awful because it not only didn't provide any value, those tests dragged the project down because you had to maintain those tests along with the project itself. It didn't last long, thankfully. So maybe, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks or a month. And this guideline was retracted eventually, but still it was a good lesson as to not to chase any specific high coverage number. Because if you do that, you will divert the focus of developers from the things that really matter, such as developing your software and developing good unit tests, to these artificial metrics, these 100% test coverage, which is never a good idea.
The whole idea of unit testing and your journey to get to this book, how has writing this book, doing the research, how has it changed you?
So I was writing the material in this book during the last several years. So this book is, I can say that it's basically the second edition already, because I wrote a lot of that material previously on my blogs, on my Plurals. I described these principles in my Pluralsight courses. So I already was familiar with a lot of this stuff and already did all the research beforehand, but it still helped me a lot to crystallize even further all this knowledge into something really dense and digestible, something that can be digested from start to finish. I tried to structure the book such that it grows organically from the first chapters to the next, where in the first chapters I laid out the principles, so why you need unit testing, and then what the pillars of a good unit test are. And then I try to structure the rest of the book in such a way that all the principles and guidelines, they organically follow from those first principles. And that's what I like about books in general, when they don't just claim, don't just throw unsubstantiated claims around, and they first define their terms and then describe all the guidelines from those terms, from those first principles.
The creation process of doing this, obviously you wrote it, rewrote it. Did it change how you view the world by writing a book?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, it's a good question. I think I would say that this book helped me connect different areas of my expertise together. So unit testing is fundamentally not only about unit tests, because unit tests are inherently coupled to the code they test, so to the underlying production code. And it's impossible to write good unit tests without refactoring, without putting effort into the underlying production code. And so because of this inherent connection, unit tests require you to also pay attention to the code that you write. And so this is where you step into this area of general programming principles, general code design, such as, for example, functional programming and how it connects to good unit testing, to this pattern, really good pattern, humble object design pattern, where you separate your business logic from basically everything else. And this pattern it stays behind a lot of other existing programming patterns, for example, behind an MVC pattern. So in MVC, you also separate your model, your domain model, which is the M letter in the MVC pattern, from the view, and introduce a mediator between the two, the controller that mediates the domain logic and the view logic. And so I tried to show how all these connect to each other, where you have to do basically the same thing. You have to separate your domain model, make it isolated from the outside world and from everything else other than the domain logic itself. And when you do that, you are able to write unit tests such that they are really cheap to maintain. So they don't require you a lot of effort to write and maintain, but they still provide a lot of value because those tests help you. Those tests cover the most essential parts of your application, the business logic, the heart of your software. And also there are a lot of connections between those different patterns, actually. So for example, this separation also connects to the principle of test pyramid, where you have this 3-layer pyramid where on the bottom of it you have unit tests, and those unit tests are the majority of your test suite. In the middle, you have integration tests, and the upper layer you have end-to-end tests. And so the idea here is that the more tests you have, the closer they should be to the code itself. So unit tests are the closest to the production code, and they are the majority, as I said. And then the end-to-end tests are the minority, but they emulate the user behavior the most. So they are not as connected to the production code as unit tests. And so this is also connected to this idea of separation business logic from everything else, because with unit tests, what you do is you basically test this business logic. And with integration and end-to-end tests, you test not the business logic itself, but the way that business logic connects to out-of-process dependencies, such as the database, the file system, and so on. We can talk more about this separation if you want, or if you have any other ideas, we can discuss them too. Just not sure what's the plan.
Before we start getting toward the end here, one of the things that actually struck me a lot was chapter 11, where you talked a lot about antipatterns. And maybe it's, the day and age, but antipatterns are at least resonate a lot with me. Of the antipatterns that you wrote about in chapter 11, or antipatterns that you may have discovered along the way, which one of those was? My mental model was to ask you which one the most nefarious was, but which one would you think is the worst of the bunch?
So the most prevalent of those is probably testing private methods. And this is the most prevalent because it's really tempting to just, expose those private methods for the sole purpose of unit testing them. This idea looks plausible because it's not always possible to test those private methods otherwise. And what I recommend you do is you need not to test those private methods directly, but you should test them indirectly through the public API of the class. So where it becomes problematic is when those private methods are significantly more complex than the public methods that use those private methods. And so in this situation, it's not obvious at all how to test those private methods through the public API. And so here, for example, I recommend that if the complexity of those private methods is large enough that it requires the testing of those private methods directly, then you should extract them into a separate class and test that separate class separately. So the complexity here is a good indication that there is a missing abstraction in the code that you need to extract and separate from that first class that uses that abstraction. And this tendency to unit test private methods, it falls into the larger category of antipatterns that, when you provide your unit tests with special privileges. So it's never a good idea to provide your tests with privileges that other code doesn't have. So exposing private methods is just one of those privileges. Another could be exposing private state that you would otherwise keep private, but you could expose it just for the ease of unit testing. And your unit tests should be just another client of the underlying production code. And it shouldn't have any special privileges because otherwise it leads to a violation of encapsulation of the underlying production code. And it also leads to a lot of false positives, a lot of false alarms where your tests start to break when you modify those private methods. So basically those private methods are implementation details, and you shouldn't tie your unit tests to those private implementation details. And the reason why you shouldn't do that is because when you modify those implementation details, your tests fail, and this leads to a lot of noise produced by those tests. And one of the most important characteristics of unit tests is the signal-to-noise ratio, where you want your unit tests to produce a lot of signal. So basically, you want them to reveal any bugs that you might introduce, but you want them to do that with as little noise as possible. Because even if your tests are able to find all the bugs in your code, they would still be worthless if they do that with a lot of irrelevant noise. So if they break without good reason, without the actual bug being in this production code.
Cool. I'm just sitting here scribbling notes. Vladimir Khorikov, author of Unit Testing, Principles, Practices, and Patterns. Who would you say that you wrote this book for?
I wrote it probably for myself 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, I worked with unit testing, had been working with unit testing for a couple of years already. And I knew all the basics, all the foundations, but it was still not enough. And I still had to struggle a lot with how to unit test it properly. And so I wrote the book for people like myself who have these basics covered, those foundations covered. They know how to structure a test. They know how to use assertions and everything like that, but they still don't know how to get the most ROI on their effort. So that's the primary audience of the book, people who already have some experience with unit testing but want to bring their skills to the next level.
So if you went back in time and handed yourself a copy of this book, would you be a better programmer today?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I would save myself a lot of effort, a lot of time going into wrong directions all the time. Yeah, for sure.
Vladimir, if you woke up tomorrow morning, somebody handed you a hot cup of your caffeinated beverage of choice and a magic wand and said that you could change any two things that affect unit testing, what would those two things be and why?
I think a lot of people don't pay much attention to one of the pillars that I described in the book, and that is to resistance to refactoring. And so this is the component that is responsible for the noise component in the signal-to-noise ratio. So the more your tests are resistant to refactoring, the less noise they generate. And a lot of people don't pay attention to that because a lot of projects, frankly, they don't get into this stage where refactoring itself becomes important, because the need in refactoring is not immediate. You don't need to refactor your code when you're just starting out, because you basically have all this code in your memory and you know it start to finish, you know it end to end. And where refactoring starts to have an importance is when you already maybe develop the project for a year or two and need to maintain its quality. And you do that by refactoring some internal things, maybe cleaning something up, maybe restructuring it in a way that better corresponds to the new requirements. And so when you do that, you don't want your tests to break, because that produces, as I said, a lot of noise and reduces the value of those tests. The reason why you write your tests is that they help you find bugs after your refactoring, but they do that without producing false positives. And it's important to structure your tests such that the number of false positive is the minimum. So the ideal is, of course, zero, but it's not always possible. And a lot of people just don't pay attention to that. And it's really important. This metric is as important as finding bugs themselves. So it's the two components, the signal and noise, they are both very important. And it's a test that is capable of finding all bugs is worthless if it does that with a lot of noise. So because all that signal is lost in all that irrelevant information.
So that's one.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So two, you said you asked for two. Let's see. So I guess the second one would be an easier one. A lot of people don't pay, they do pay attention to test naming, but a lot of people still name the tests, I think, in a suboptimal manner. So what a lot of people do, and the pattern that I often see, is that something like given when then. And this given when then pattern also goes to the test naming. For example, when you test something like delivery service and whether or not this delivery service deems some future date as valid for delivery, you can name this test something like delivery service given future date returns false, something like that. So, and this test looks good at first because we are programmers and we're used to these names, because these names are basically, they repeat the content of the test. But it's still not ideal because your tests should describe the behavior of your software. They should describe the implementation of the test itself. So, and you should name the tests accordingly. So in this particular example, what you could do instead is you could just name the test something like future delivery is invalid. So you shouldn't say how this future delivery being invalid is manifested in the code. It could be that the delivery service returns you false when you call its is delivery valid method, or it could be some other way. But this human readable naming helps you understand the behavior of your code, of your application. And this is where a lot of people do it suboptimally. They try to bring the implementation into the name of the test, whereas the better way to do that would be to describe the behavior of your application with this test naming.
Fair. And I probably have fallen into that trap, especially once I learned Gherkin. So that probably took me down that path personally. Vladimir Khorikov, author of Unit Testing. How would people continue this conversation if they grab a copy of the book and are looking to continue the conversation?
Sure. The best way to find me is go to painlessunit-testing.com. I wrote a short 5 days email course where I outlined the top 5 mistakes that you could encounter in unit testing. So that would be the shortest way to find me. And yeah, so that's the best. I'm also on Twitter, so you can find me at, you probably wouldn't be able to spell my name, but
I'll have that contact information in the show notes.
Okay, yeah. But the easiest way is to just go to painlessunit-testing.com.
Vladimir, at this point in the show, I open up the platform for you to promote anything you'd like. I do want to point out that we are, by the time this airs, we are somewhere in either right around the middle of year 14 for the podcast. So it's been around for a while. Selling your car on eBay is probably not very valuable for this part. So platform is yours. Anything that you would like to promote?
Sure. The only thing I would like to promote is really my book, because I put a lot of effort in it, and I would really like as many people to read it as possible. And I don't get a lot of royalties, so it's not about money. It's just I wouldn't like to go all this effort of mine to waste. I would like to spread this book to as many people as possible. So go grab the book, the copy. You wouldn't regret it.
No, I don't think so. And I enjoyed reading it myself. As also an author, I think one writes books, especially because none of us are going to get rich from these kind of books. We write books to change the world. Is that not in essence, why you did it.
Yeah, it is. Certainly.
Vladimir Khorikov, this has been absolutely fantastic. I want to thank you for spending time with the audience on the Software Process and Measurement Cast. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Tom, for having me. Thank you.
In Reread Saturday News, we worked on getting ready to talk. Now it's time to get into the meat of a dialogue. Chapter 7 of Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High, is where the rubber hits the road. In many circumstances, this is actually where the wheels come off. Instead, the authors present 5 skills for talking when what you have to say could make others feel defensive. There's a link in the show notes to this week's entry in the Reread Saturday series. If you do not have your copy of Crucial Conversations or have tossed it at someone, please use the link in the show notes and buy a copy. Using the link in the show notes helps support the blog and the podcast. We have 2 upcoming events that I want to call your attention to: the Dev Online Summit 2020 and Idea Fest. Dev Online Summit is April 20th through 24th. The Idea Fest is April 21st and 22nd. Here are promos for both of those events.
Hi, I'm Tom Henriksen from the DevOps Online Summit. If you're interested in DevOps or work in the DevOps area, you're going to want to check out what we have coming up called the DevOps Online Summit. It's going to start April 20th through the 24th, Monday through Friday, and we have a lot of great content you're going to want to be watching. And we're going to have some great people. You're going to be able to bring your questions and get answers from these DevOps professionals during our Ask Me Anything sessions. We're going to have multiples scheduled. So check out the website. It's devopsonlinesummit.com/2020. This is our 2020 session. We actually did one last year, our first one. So we're bringing it back, and it's better than ever. So you're going to want to check out the DevOps Online Summit.
Did you ever wonder where all those great canceled speakers from all those great canceled conferences ended up?
Jeff, I know where they went to. They went to IdeaFest 2020. And we have some of the best thought leaders talking about Agile, CMMI, CMMC, and performance excellence.
At least 16 hours of some of the best speakers from the best conferences will be joining together on April 21st and 22nd for the best value you'll ever experience in a conference.
You'll get more education and breakthrough thoughts for $99 in 2 days than you would get anywhere else at any other conference.
We have amazing keynotes, track speakers, panels on CMMC, Agile, CMMI, and process transformation, all for $99.
It's going to be exceptional.
And as we get to the end of the day, we're going to feature a very special event. Tell us about us, Michael.
We're going to have a virtual happy hour, Jeff. It's going to be wonderful, where all of the attendees can chat with each other. They can ask questions of you and I. And we will, of course, all be doing that, enjoying our favorite adult beverage.
The best value you'll ever see for $99 on April 21st and 22nd, ideafest2020.org. We hope to see you there.
See you there.
In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 596, we will feature our interview with Tom Henriksen. Tom brings the industry, the DevOps, and Agile Online Summits, and is an active thought leader in the Agile community. We talked about learning and sharpening the saw. The idea of tuning your capabilities has never been more important. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?